What if the Romans had discovered the Americas? Roma Occidentis. Imagine you are a Roman trader in the year 200 AD. You are pulling into the port of Roma Occidentis, Western Rome. It is your first time arriving here, but you have a fairly good idea of what to expect. Even for a cosmopolitan empire like that of the Romans, the people in the streets of Roma Occidentis might strike the Roman trader as being a bit peculiar on arrival. Many are dressed lightly and walk around with war paint on their faces. In the markets, goods that our Roman has rarely seen before, things like potatoes and squash, are widely available. There are also tomatoes in abundance, the food that many Romans back in Italy have started putting on bread with cheese. Our Roman has come a long way. He is on the northeastern corner of what we now term Brazil. But it is a thriving port town called Roma Occidentis, Western Rome, a port of the Romans in America, built up over the 70 years since Roman explorers first drifted off course and accidentally discovered the Americas in the reign of Emperor Hadrian. This is the story of how the Romans could have discovered the Americas and what might have happened thereafter if they had. Did the Romans ever reach the Americas? One thing that is worth establishing first off is that there is a possibility that the Romans did actually discover the Americas. Over the years, evidence has emerged from a number of places in the New World which suggests contact between the New World and the Old in ancient times. For instance, in 1933, the Tlaxcalixtlahuaca head was discovered amongst other grave goods in a burial tomb in Mexico. It looks nothing like a Mayan or Aztec statue head, and many archaeologists have argued that it is stylistically derived from Roman sculpture and demonstrates evidence of Roman-era contact between Europe and the Americas. It is one of several archaeological discoveries that were made in the 20th century, which possibly point towards cultural diffusion between the Romans and the native cultures of Central America. There have also been numerous discoveries of Roman coins in the Americas over the past few centuries. However, the latter are hard to evaluate. Some are believed to be hoax discoveries that were planted by individuals seeking to make it look like they had made a great discovery, while others need not necessarily indicate Roman contact with the Americas. After all, a Spanish conquistador could have had a few Roman coins on him in the 16th century and simply dropped them somewhere. That isn't as implausible as it seems when we consider that there are an estimated 25 million Roman coins in circulation around the world that have survived since antiquity. While these examples constitute very loose possible evidence for Roman-era contact between the Old World and the New, there is no doubt that the Romans were an intrepid people who were interested in voyaging and finding new lands. As soon as they conquered Egypt in 30 BCE, they organized expeditions across the Red Sea to Arabia and began fanning out down the Red Sea into the Indian Ocean and beyond. There is also evidence of the Romans having established contact with regions as far to the east as Sri Lanka and Indochina, while back in the Mediterranean world, several expeditions were sent south into the Sahara Desert and the Horn of Africa in the 1st century BCE and the 1st century CE. Given all of this interest in overseas exploration and discovery, ultimately with the goal of establishing valuable trade, it is plausible to imagine the occasional expedition being sent down the coast of Western Africa or into the North Sea in ways which could have led to the discovery of the New World. How would the Romans have discovered the Americas? There are numerous scenarios whereby they might have done so. Some of it could have occurred accidentally. In fact, this is how several European explorers of the 15th and 16th centuries discovered parts of the New World. For instance, while it is not widely known about in the public domain, Historians have understood for decades that English fishermen sailing out of ports like Bristol in England were fishing in the waters off of Newfoundland in Canada in the 1480s, many years before Columbus reached the Caribbean. They had probably simply been drawn there by fish migratory patterns, and once the Newfoundland banks were established as a fishery, they returned there year after year without realizing the magnitude of the discovery they had made. Pedro Cabral, the Portuguese explorer who discovered Brazil in 1500, was sailing from Portugal to India around Africa when he was blown off course and landed in Brazil, right around where our hypothetical Roma Occidentis is located. Thus, many people who discovered parts of the Americas in the age of exploration did so completely by accident. Something similar might have happened with the Romans. Imagine if the Roman state had suddenly become interested in the early 2nd century AD in recreating the voyage of the great Carthaginian explorer, Hanno the Navigator, who in the middle of the first millennium BCE had led a voyage of discovery down the coast of Western Africa, perhaps as far as countries like the Ivory Coast or even Nigeria. If the Romans had started exploring the African coastline in this way, inspired by Hanno's exploits, maybe a ship would be blown off course and suddenly end up making landfall on the northeastern coast of Brazil, right around where our make-believe Roma Occidentis was located. Before long, the Romans would have established an outpost and continued to explore further. Alternatively, the Romans could have discovered the northern parts of the Americas. We know from archaeological evidence that the Romans were trading extensively in the North Sea to places like Ireland and Denmark that lay beyond the borders of their empire. It isn't implausible that they could have discovered Iceland and then used that as a stepping stone to Greenland and Newfoundland. Particularly so when we consider that in the writings of Pythias of Massalia, a 4th century BC Greek explorer from Marseille in southern France, they had evidence of a fabled land called Thule, which lay to the north of Britain. Would it have been feasible to conquer any lands? There are many plausible scenarios in which the Romans could have found their way to the Western Hemisphere, and as we have seen, there is the possibility that some Romans actually did, albeit without realizing the enormity of their discovery. But discovering a land is one thing. The bigger question is, could they have done anything to capitalize on these discoveries? Could the Romans have actually conquered parts of the Americas and brought them under their control? We can probably best gauge this by comparing the Romans with the kingdoms of Europe that discovered and then conquered the Americas in the age of exploration. This can provide useful points of comparison. First off, the European powers took centuries to conquer the Western Hemisphere. For the most part, the rapid conquests made by the Spanish in the first half of the 16th century, of the Caribbean islands first, then of the Aztec Empire in Central America, and finally the Inca Empire in the northwest of South America, were somewhat anomalous. They also were primarily owing to the devastation caused by the arrival of measles and smallpox to the New World, as these twin epidemics largely wiped out entire native populations, particularly so in the Caribbean, where the native Taino and Carib peoples were devastated by them. Thereafter, the Europeans faced an uphill battle to defeat many native powers. The Algonquian people of the eastern seaboard of North America nearly destroyed the English colonies there on several occasions in the 17th century. Large parts of South America remained effectively independent of Spanish rule well into the 18th century, while the Americans were still fighting substantial wars against the Lakota and Sioux Indians of the Great Plains as late as the 1850s, 1860s, and 1870s. There is no reason to believe that the Romans wouldn't have faced opposition to their arrival that was just as stiff. Moreover, their technology was not well suited to the task. The Romans didn't have guns, something which gave the Europeans of later centuries a distinct advantage over the natives. Perhaps most notably, the Romans used oar-rowed galleys to get around on the tranquil waters of the Mediterranean. Regular travel across the Atlantic Ocean between the Old and New Worlds required wind-powered sailing ships, another area in which the Romans would have been in deficit. Thus, the Romans would have possibly been able to carve out a few colonies on the Atlantic seaboard on the eastern shores of the Americas, like our fictitious Roma Occidentis. But it is altogether more debatable that they would have been able to acquire any major presence in the Americas at a time when they needed to invest huge amounts of resources into shoring up the northern border of their empire back in Europe. Would they have cared? Then there is the question of whether or not they would have been bothered with colonizing and conquering parts of the Americas. Often, when we think about European powers discovering the Americas, we assume that as soon as this occurred, they would have been tripping over themselves to take advantage of the new opportunities for conquest and plunder that opened up before them. This actually couldn't be further from the truth. In reality, even after the Spanish and English discovered different parts of the New World in the 1490s, almost none of the European powers did anything about it for some time. Spain is the exception, as both it and Portugal were already primed to become Atlantic powers by 1492. But the other major European states of the time hardly rushed to get in on conquering the New World. England established its first permanent New World colony in 1607 at Jamestown in Virginia, well over a century after Columbus and Cabot first reached the New World. France established its first permanent colony in what is now Canada, right around the same time as the foundation of Jamestown. What really brought about mass colonization was the discovery in the 17th century that cash crops like tobacco and sugar could be cultivated in the Caribbean and North America. Prior to this, colonies were not a major priority for kingdoms like England and France that were dealing with religious wars in the aftermath of the Protestant Reformation back home in Europe. The same would surely have been true for the Romans. They would have had little interest in investing enormous time and energy into building new types of ships fit for the Atlantic Passage and then establishing colonies in the New World, not for the sake of acquiring potatoes, tomatoes, squash, and other goods that could not be obtained in the Old World. Perhaps over time, the Romans would have developed an addiction to tobacco, as happened eventually in Europe in the centuries following the establishment of contact with the New World. But there would have been no huge draw to bring the Romans to the Americas. If they were going to invest this kind of money on complex overseas conquests, they would have done so in the Indian Ocean, what they called the Erythraean Sea. The Romans had extensive connections to India, from whence they traded an array of exotic and extremely valuable spices, drugs, and manufactured goods. There is even evidence of Roman temples being built in Western India. If the Romans were unwilling to invest the kind of resources needed to establish colonies in places like India, then there is absolutely no reason why they should have done so in the Americas. This is not a power that by the imperial age was looking to conquer every land it came into contact with. Ireland remained unconquered by the Romans, as did lands like Denmark in the North Sea that they traded to, as indeed did large sections of Saharan Africa that the Romans were in contact with, but saw no reason to try and conquer. The Romans would probably have set up a few trading stations in the Americas and left it at that. There was no economic incentive to do anything else. Legacy. It's hard to imagine that the Romans would have spread out and developed extensive colonies in the Americas, especially with so many problems multiplying at home in Europe in the shape of civil wars, economic crises, and the invasion of their northern borders by waves of Germanic and Asiatic tribes from the north and east. In this light, probably the foremost impact of a Roman discovery and exploration of the Americas would have been the legacy it left to future cultures in Europe and the former lands of the Roman Empire. Powers like the Kingdom of the Franks or the various Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of England wouldn't have been in a position to do anything about it for centuries after the fall of Rome. But once medieval society began to advance and develop rapidly in the 12th and 13th centuries, the Christian powers would have been able to capitalize on the knowledge that had been passed down to them from the Romans of the lands out west across the Atlantic. Perhaps European powers like France and England would have begun to set up colonies in the Americas earlier than they did. Of course, it's a two-way street. Maybe cultures like the Mayans or the Mississippi culture of North America would have been introduced to European diseases like smallpox and measles in a much more gradual manner, and their populations would not have been wiped out in the way they were following the arrival of the Spanish in the 15th and 16th centuries. Alternatively, they could have begun to absorb some of the technologies of the European powers over the centuries, and might have been better prepared to withstand the attacks of the newcomers when they arrived with their guns and horses and iron armor in centuries to come. Thus, a Roman discovery of the Americas would probably have had its greatest impact centuries after the Romans themselves. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel to show your support, and watch more content like this. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. That's it for now. We'll see you in the next one.